You're no longer good for anything, Mom. You just eat and get fat.
Those words came out of my daughter's mouth on a Tuesday, September 14th, at 9:17 at night. I didn't respond. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing any cracks in my face. I stood in the center of that kitchen that I had cleaned every morning for 13 years and simply looked at her with a calmness that I myself did not expect. Because there comes a time in life when a woman stops reacting and starts observing. And I had been watching for months. For the last 4 months without Valeria knowing, I had been recording every detail with a precision that she could never have imagined. And that night, as she looked into my eyes, waiting for an answer, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. What my daughter didn't know that night was that minutes later, before I walked through that door for the last time, I would place in her hands an envelope that I had prepared with great care. And what was inside would cause her entire world, the world that I had held on my shoulders for 13 years, to begin to crumble with her being able to do anything to stop it. But before we get to that, I need you to get to know me. Because if you don't know who Patricia Morales is, you won't understand what I did or why I did it or why. With my hand on my heart, I would do it exactly the same way again. My name is Patricia Morales, and I'm 61 years old. I was born in Guadalajara, in a neighborhood where the houses were humble, but the tables were never empty. My mother, Mrs. Carmen, taught me 3 things that I have never forgotten throughout my life. Get up early, don't owe favors, and never, ever let anyone steal your dignity. Those 3 lessons are all I need to tell you this story. I was a nurse for 34 years. I started at 22, with nervous hands and a heart bigger than my brain. I specialized in emergencies. I worked nights for almost 2 decades. I learned to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between someone seeing the sunrise or not. And above all, I learned to document every medication, every adverse reaction, every detail that might be needed later, not as bureaucracy, but as a lifeline. That habit of documenting everything would save me 13 years later, in a way I never imagined, but I'll get to that. I married Ernesto when I was 27. He was a mechanic. He had calloused hands, always with traces of grease under his nails that wouldn't come off even after washing them 3 times. And he had the most honest eyes I'd ever seen in my life. Together, we built a small house in the north of the city, 2 children, and 20 years of sharing early mornings. We had Marco, the oldest, and Valeria, the youngest. I raised them with what I had, and also with what I didn't. I gave them time, presence, sacrifice. I promised myself before God and my mother that as long as I was breathing, my children would not lack the essentials. Ernesto died on a Sunday in November, 16 years ago. A massive heart attack, the doctors said. We were watching the news after dinner. The cup of tea I had made for him was still lukewarm when the ambulance arrived. He was 52 years old. He vanished, no goodbyes, no visible pain, no time for anything. I was left alone with a nursing pension, a paid-for house, and a silence in the house that I learned to endure without showing it. That's how I had been raised. But before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you for something. If you're watching this video and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. It takes you 2 seconds, and it helps me more than you can imagine. Also, leave a like. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. From Mexico, from Colombia, from Venezuela, from Spain, from the United States. I really want to know how far this story has gone, to know that I'm not alone in this. Okay, so let's continue. 3 years after Ernesto died, at 8:46 on a Monday morning, I got a call from Valeria. I saved that number. I still have it. Mom, we're having a hard time with the kids. Rodrigo and I both work, and They're still young. Would you come live here for a while? Just until the situation stabilizes. Just for a while. Those 2 words. I moved in on February 3rd. I arrived with 2 suitcases, a small box with Ernesto's photos and the certainty that I was doing the right thing, exactly. The apartment smelled of freshly brewed coffee and the band's detergent, and the morning light streamed in through the large windows in the dining room and made the floor shine as if it had been polished to welcome me. Valeria hugged me at the door. Her arms smelled of the perfume she always wore, the one, with white flowers that I, myself, had given her years before. The children, Sophia and Damian, ran barefoot down the hallway to greet me. The floor was cold beneath their feet, but they didn't seem to feel it. I felt at that moment that I was in the right place. What I didn't see then, what no mother sees when she loves too much, were the first threads of something that would tighten around me over the years without me even noticing. I woke up at 5:45 every morning. The cold of the ceramic floor woke me up faster than my alarm clock. I made breakfast, took the kids to school, came back, cleaned, cooked, washed, ironed. I picked the kids up at 2:30, helped them with their homework while the pot on the stove filled the apartment with the smell of broth. I made dinner, and when Valeria and Rodrigo came home exhausted at night, they found everything in order, everything working. And in addition to my job, I paid for the gas, the internet, half of the groceries, the medicines. When the kids got sick, the school supplies, the birthday presents, Sophia's first communion. 13 years of constant contributions that no one ever counted. No one except me. Because I am a nurse, and in 34 years I have learned that details matter, that records save, and that memory alone is not enough. By Tuesday, September 14, I had collected more than 400 pages of receipts, transfers, and personal notes to Ote. I didn't know then what I would need them for. I only knew that I had to save them. And when Valeria looked me in the eyes that night and said what she said, I understood, with a clarity that almost surprised me, that the time had come to use them. What was inside that envelope that I left on the table? You will find out about that. But first you need to understand what happened during those 13 years doing notions. The signs that I ignored. The times I chose to stay when I should have left, and the role of Rodrigo, her husband, in all of this. Because the story I am about to tell you does not have a single dark character. It has several. And the worst of all was not who I thought. Rodrigo, I'm going to ask you to remember that name carefully, to write it down, if necessary, and not to let it go. When I moved into Valeria's apartment on February 3rd, Rodrigo Fuentes had already been married to my daughter for 6 years. He was a sales supervisor at a construction materials distributor. He wore a tie on Thursdays and Fridays when he had meetings with big clients. The rest of the week he wore jeans and a wide, easy smile that he would flash at just the right moment. From the beginning, it created something in me that I didn't know how to name exactly. It settled somewhere between my stomach and my chest and wouldn't go away. It wasn't distrust. It was more like that feeling you get in the hallways of a hospital when you hear footsteps that don't fit the rhythm of the place. Something out of tune. Something that your body registers before your mind processes it. Your body always knows first. I learned that in the emergency room too. 34 years of emergency rooms teach you to trust that feeling, and yet I ignored it. The first few months in that apartment were, on the surface, completely ordinary. I would wake up at 5:45. The cold of the ceramic floor would wake me up faster than my alarm clock. By 6:30, I would have breakfast ready, and Sophia and Damian's lunchboxes prepared on the kitchen counter. I would take them to school, come back clean, do the laundry, cook lunch, pick up the kids at 2, in the afternoon, help them with their homework, make dinner, put away, dirty dishes, turn off the lights. Valeria would arrive around 7:30 at night. Rodrigo would sometimes arrive earlier, sometimes much later, sometimes without giving any explanation. And on top of all that, I paid. I paid for his gas every month for 13 years. I gave him half of the groceries from the first Monday I went to the market. I gave him their medicine when the kids got sick without anyone asking me to be because I couldn't stand by and watch. I gave him Augustus school supplies every August, year after year, without anyone writing it down anywhere. I gave him my own grandchildren's birthday presents because Valeria always late each month. I gave him Sophia's entire first communion, the dress, the flowers, the lunch for the guests, the little souvenirs the kids took home, be dead. I gave him their school uniforms when the sizes changed and there wasn't enough money. I gave him all that for 13 years, and I gave it all without keeping track, because I thought that was how a family is built. That was what it meant to be a mother, a grandmother, to be part of something worth supporting, but I was wrong about something fundamental. Giving without keeping track is not generosity, it's naivete. I understood that too late. What I didn't know then was that Rodrigo had been working for months on something that took me too long to see, building something in silence, with the patience of someone who knows they don't need to rush. And I want to tell you when I first began to suspect it, because it was at such a young age that anyone would have dismissed it. Anyone who hadn't spent 34 years learning to read what no one says out loud. It was a Wednesday in May at 1:37 in the afternoon. I was in the kitchen finishing lunch. Plenty chicken in tomato sauce, red rice, beans, from the pot. The smell of fresh cilantro that I had chopped that morning still hung in the air. My hands were busy, my attention focused on the stove, when I heard the door to my room open. I stood still for a moment. The kids were at school. Valeria was at work. I went into the hallway with the spoon in my hand and my heart beating a little slower than normal, in that way that the body holds its breath before confirming something. Rodrigo was coming out of my room, Talacho. He looked at me without any start, with that calmness of his that sometimes unsettled me more than a scream, without blinking, without changing the color of his face. He said, "I was looking for some scissors, mother-in-law." And he continued into the living room as if nothing had happened, as if I weren't there, as if my room were just another transit space in that house, so I didn't answer. The scissors had been in the kitchen drawer for 6 years. He knew that perfectly well. I went into my room. Everything seemed in its place. The bed was neatly made, the curtains as I had left them, the light from the hallway filtering in just as always. But the little wooden box where I keep important documents, the one that belonged to my mother, the one I carried in my suitcase when I moved because I couldn't leave it behind, was a few centimeters further towards the edge of the nightstand than I had left it that morning. It may sound exaggerated. It may seem like I'm making it up. It may seem like an elderly lady mixes up things. But 34 years of emergency care teaches you that details don't lie. Only people do. That afternoon, I went to the stationery store on the corner, the same one where I bought the children's notebooks, and bought a black notebook. I walked home slowly. I sat down at the dining room table with a pen that worked well. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote exactly what I had seen, word for word, without embellishment or omissions. I didn't know at the time why I was doing it. I just knew that I had to do it, that something in me demanded that it be recorded. That was the first entry in a notebook that would eventually have 142 written pages. But keep that in mind, because I'm going to need you to remind me of it later. What happened 6 weeks later made me let my guard down in a way that I still find hard to forgive myself for. It pains me, because I should have known. That sudden kindness, when it comes from where you don't expect it, almost always comes with a price that hasn't yet been charged. It was a Thursday afternoon. Rodrigo arrived home earlier than usual, with a bouquet of orange and yellow flowers wrapped in burlap. He handed them to me in the kitchen with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Softer, almost humble, his shoulders slightly slumped like someone who's about to confess something. "Mother-in-law," he said, "I want to apologize. I know I haven't been the most attentive since you arrived. Work has me really busy, and sometimes I arrive in a bad mood. You deserve it more." Valeria was standing in the kitchen doorway, nodding, with her arms crossed and an expression too calm to be spontaneous. I had the feeling that they had talked about it before he arrived, that they had rehearsed the timing. But I didn't say anything. I felt something that I now have trouble admitting out loud. Genuine relief. The kind of relief that loosens your shoulders and relieves the pressure in your chest. The kind of relief that makes you want to believe. I thought maybe I had been wrong. That the scissors thing had been exactly what he had said. That everything would find its natural rhythm. Like any family that is learning to live together finds its rhythm. I put the dahlias in a tall glass next to the dining room window. That night the four of us had dinner together, with Sofia and Damian also at the table. And Rodrigo told a joke about a bricklayer and an architect that made the children laugh until Damian spat out his soda. Sofia covered her mouth with both hands, dying with laughter. It was a good night. One of those nights that one keeps in a drawer of memory because they shine a little brighter than the others. Because on them one believes, even if only for a few hours, that things can be simple. It was the last night of that kind for a long time. After 15 days, on the evening of July 20th at 9:08 p.m., I heard the sound of Rodrigo's keys hitting the entrance furniture with considerable force. The sound was abrupt, like something thrown, not put down. The steps that followed were different from the usual ones. Harder, more deliberate, with the weight of someone who had already made a decision before crossing the door. Before I could peek out from the kitchen, I heard her voice addressing Valakle's room. "Have you told your mother about the money?" Silence. "Valeria, have you told her or not?" 2 minutes later, my daughter entered the kitchen with an expression that wasn't entirely her own, like a face that someone else had given her that afternoon, and that she still hadn't finished getting used to. "Mama, Rodrigo says that this month we're really tight. We need you to not pay for gas or internet for the next 2 months. We'll catch up with you as soon as the bill is paid." I took the dishcloth and folded it, carefully, corner by corner. I placed it on the counter. "Okay," I said. There was no more conversation. No eyes met. But that night, when the house fell silent and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the passing of a distant car, I opened the black notebook, wrote the date, the amount, my daughter's exact words, exactly as she had said them, and then, almost without thinking, I wrote a question that was not addressed to anyone in particular. Who decides in this house? 900 pesos a month, gas, and internet. They never returned it to me. Not that month, not the next, not in the 12 years, and then months that came after. That was the first amount that was never returned. It was not the last. Do you want to know how much 30 years of contributions that no one accounted for add up to? That was also in the envelope from Friday, September 17. Everything itemized, with dates, receipts, with clean and aligned numbers, with the clarity of a nurse who spent decades filling out files that could save or sink someone. I knew very well what a record was worth, but before I get to that envelope, I need you to understand something about Rodrigo. Because the scissors and the money weren't oversights. They weren't the stress of work. They weren't the clumsy mistakes of a poorly organized man. They were the first moves of someone who knew exactly what he was building, and he was building it on me, on my silence, on my willingness to fold the dishcloth and say, okay. And Valeria, my daughter, the girl I raised alone so many nights while Ernesto worked the night shift, the same one whose sought me out with her arms outstretched when she had nightmares, and who fell asleep with her head resting on my shoulder while I sang to her softly to make the fear go away. She knew what was happening, or she was also a victim of that man. I had also convinced her that everything was normal, that this is how families work, that asking without giving back is just a way of spreading the burden. That question gnawed at me for years. I asked myself this question quietly at night, the notebook closed on my lap. I asked myself this question while I cooked, while I made the beds, while I watched my grandchildren grow up in a house that I supported without anyone recognizing it. And the answer, when it finally came, was the hardest of all the answers I had to bear in this story. The answer came in the third year, and it didn't come all at once. It came the way most that one doesn't want to see come in small fragments, separated by weeks of apparent normality, so spaced out that it was easy to convince oneself that they didn't form any pattern, that they were coincidences, that they were the natural wear and tear of living under the same roof with people who didn't choose you, but who were one. And I, who had spent 34 years training my eye to detect what isn't said out loud, chose not to see it for far too long, wakadi too long. That's what I have the hardest time admitting. Not what was done to me, but how long I allowed it to happen. How many mornings have I woken up at 5:45, turned on the stove, and decided, without calling it a decision, to remain silent, to remain. The first clear indication was one Saturday in March at 11:20 in the morning. I was in the living room reading when Rodrigo arrived unannounced with a couple of his friends. There were people I didn't know. They entered with noise, with loud conversations, with that energy of people who feel that the space is completely theirs and that no one has ever told them that it isn't. Rodrigo glanced at me briefly, didn't introduce me, and asked Momolisku kakmakwafa, pointing to the hallway. Could you go to your room, mother-in-law? Will we need the living room? It wasn't a question. You know that. The tone left no room for error. There wasn't a comma of real courtesy in that sentence. I got up, picked up my book, and walked to the room with a regular step, without rushing, without dragging my feet. I closed the door carefully, without slamming it, without making a comment. It was 11:20 on a Saturday morning, and I had been sent to my room like a 6-year-old girl. I sat on the edge of my bed. Outside, I could hear laughter and the clink of glasses. I could smell the snacks I had prepared that morning without knowing for whom. Toast with beans, pickled, peppers crumbled, cheese on a lay plate all ready on the kitchen counter when the strangers arrived. The ceiling of the room was white and smooth, and I stared at it for a while without reading a single page, without thinking about anything in particular, just letting the silence of the room do its work. I opened the black notebook. I wrote the date and time. I wrote the exact words. Do you know what was the worst part? When the visitor left, Valeria passed by my room, stuck her head in with that way of hers of never quite getting anywhere, and said to me, with an uncomfortable smile, ako, "Don't bother, Mom. You know how he is." And she kept walking. You know how he is. 7 words that normalize everything that shouldn't be normal. 7 words that transfer the responsibility to the listener to adapt, to understand, to give in, as if the problem wasn't the behavior, but the sensitivity of the person receiving it, of the person receiving it. I put the notebook away and didn't say anything, because there's something that mothers learn to do since their children are little. Suppressing our emotions to avoid disrupting the peace, to not be the one who complicates things, to not be the problem causer. That's what we were taught. That a good mother doesn't cause trouble. That a good grandmother and taps. That love is shown by giving in. No one told us that this adaptation has a limit. That the limit exists, even if no one marks it with a visible sign. That when a person crosses that limit, the damage has already happened, even if it doesn't hurt yet. Sometimes we trust people who don't deserve it too much. Has this happened to you? Have you ever been in a place or a situation where you kept quiet when you should have spoken up? And do you still feel the weight of that silence somewhere in your body? Write to me in the comments. I really want to know that I'm not alone in this, because while I'm telling you all this, so there's something that gives me a lot of strength, knowing that there are people on the other side who understand who this type of pain comes from, who have also endured it, who survived. Let's continue. By the second year, 4 things had happened that I had recorded in my notebook and that I had decided to let go of one by one. 4 things that, when viewed together, formed a map, but that I had chosen to see separately, as if isolating them would take away their weight. Rodrigo had stopped greeting me. Not suddenly, gradually, with the same slow patience of someone who knows that sudden changes leave evidence. First, he stopped saying good morning to me when I was in the kitchen. Then he stopped mentioning food, even though he had served himself twice. Then he stopped looking at me when I spoke at the table, as if I were just another chair in the room. A chair that cooked, that cleaned, that paid for the gas. But a chair nonetheless, something that takes up space without deserving attention. Deliberate coldness is worse than shouting. With shouting, one knows where one is. With deliberate coldness, one begins to wonder if one exists. If what one perceives is real, or if it is a distortion of one's own, a sensitivity that had become too great over the years. I came to wonder, but the notebook would not let me doubt. Records do not have bad days. Records do not forget. Records do not convince themselves that perhaps things were different than they were. On August 8th of that second year, at 7:50 night, I wrote down something that changed the direction of everything that would come after. Valeria came home from work with a different expression, not exhausted as usual, with that flat fatigue that she brought with her every day as part of her uniform. This time it was something else. Worried, with something stuck in her that wouldn't go away. She asked me to talk in the kitchen while she changed her shoes, like she had done since she was a little girl, when something was weighing her down and she didn't know how to begin saying it. Mom, she told me, I told Rodrigo that the way he treats you isn't right, that you're my mom and you deserve respect. He told me, yes, he's right, that he's going to make an effort. I felt something that I now recognize as a premature hope, the kind of hope that feels like relief but doesn't have the same foundation. And what exactly did he tell you? I asked him. Yes, he's going to make an effort, that sometimes work makes him feel bad and he takes it out on me at home. He put his hand on my arm, with that way of his that always had something apologetic about it. Give him a chance, Mom. He's not a bad man. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that phrase, and I should have learned that when someone needs to be defended with, he's not a bad man, the conversation is already lost before it even starts. Because that phrase doesn't speak to what a man is. It speaks to what the person defending him needs to believe. But Valeria was my daughter. A mother's love for her daughter always chooses to believe, however difficult it may be. For 22 days, Rodrigo was different. He greeted me when I arrived with a brief but audible voice. Once he asked me if I needed anything from the supermarket when he was going out, and waited for my answer, standing at the door with the keys in his hand. Another night while we were having dinner, he said to Damian, "Thank your grandmother for cooking this." Damian looked at me with his 7-year-old eyes and said, "Thank you, Grandma." With that voice still of a little boy that is etched in my chest right there, where one keeps things that one doesn't know if one will be able to hear again. 22 days. Then, on August 30th at 8:52 at night, Rodrigo arrived with a frown and a clenched jaw, with the face of someone, with that tension on the face of someone who has been carrying something heavy all day and no longer has any interest in hiding it. He dropped the keys on the kitchen counter with a loud thud, like someone putting an end to something, and he didn't even look at me. He walked straight to the room, and the next day, silence settled again, as if those 22 days had never existed, as if someone had erased the pages of the calendar and returned everything to its original state. I opened the notebook again. I wrote down, the changes that last less than a month, they are not changes, they are pauses. That night of Tuesday, September 14th, was still 11 years away. 11 years in which I would continue to get up at 5:45, cook, clean, pay, keep quiet. 11 years in which the notebook would continue to fill with dates and details and amounts and exact words, with the precision that only someone who has learned that records save that what is written cannot be reinterpreted by anyone has urpori sa kahon. And Rodrigo would continue to climb a little higher each year. With that patience of his that I now understand was not patience, but strategy. What came in the third year was different in quality. It was no longer indifference. It was something more calculated, colder, harder to describe with a single word. Indifference is absence. What Rodrigo was beginning to do required presence. It required intention. One Monday in November, the anniversary of Ernesto's death, I had placed a small candle on the small table in the living room, next to the photo that I always carry with me. It was my way of remembering him, the only one I had in that house that was not completely mine. I had done this every year since his death, no matter where I was. Valeria knew it. She had always respected him. We had never needed to talk about it. That afternoon, when I got home from running errands with my bags in my hands and the fatigue of having walked 4 blocks under the sun, the candle was gone, and neither was the photo. I left the bags on the counter and wiped my hands on my apron. I asked Valeria calmly from the kitchen, in the same voice you used to ask where your keys were. She took a moment before answering. Oh, a moment too long. Rodrigo says that those things make the atmosphere in the house sad, that it's better to keep them in your room. I stood still for a second. The refrigerator hummed. A truck passed by outside. What do you think? I asked. Silence. Not the silence of someone who is thinking. The silence of someone who already knows what they would say but chose not to say it. There is a difference. After 34 years in the emergency room, you learn to tell them apart. That silence was the first time I saw clearly who Valeria was in that house. She wasn't the daughter who had known me forever, the one who sought me out in the dark when I was afraid, the one who would hug me on hospital platforms when I came home from the night shift smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. She was a woman who had learned not to have an opinion on things that didn't suit Rodrigo, who had traded her own voice for a silence that felt safer to him. I went to my room. I put Ernesto's photo on my nightstand in the same place it had always been, looking toward the window, as if I could still see something outside. I turned on the nightlight, closed the door, and with the same calmness with which a nurse fills out a file at 3 a.m. when everything around her is in chaos, when voices overlap and monitors beep and you are the only fixed point in the only fixed point, I opened the notebook, wrote the date, and added a note in the margin that I underlined twice. Rodrigo doesn't act alone. Valeria allows it, to see if she chooses or if she can't choose. It was a question that had been pushing at me from the inside for months, gently tapping against my ribs every time. I saw my daughter nod every time. I saw her turn her head to the right side, and it would take years to have an answer, but I'll get to that. What matters now is that night, while Ernesto's candle burned in my room, casting a small, still shadow on the wall, and the rest of the apartment continued with its life, as if nothing had happened, as if I didn't exist behind that closed door, something inside me began to change direction without announcing it, without making a noise, without me even calling its name yet. Very slowly. Very quietly, but it began. Can you guess what it was? What began to change in me that night wasn't anger. I had had the anger for months stored away, in a place where it didn't make any noise. What began to change was clarity. An emergency room nurse learns something that very few people understand until experience it. There is a huge difference between reacting and acting. Anyone can react. Acting requires waiting for the right moment. It requires having everything ready before moving the first piece. And I, without having consciously decided to do so yet, had begun to pre-pisas. But the worst was yet to come. Because up until that third year, Rodrigo had operated in the area of what one might dismiss as a bad temper, as work stress, as rough edges in living together. What came next no longer had any of those excuses available. It was a Friday in April, at 7:45 at night. Valeria had organized a small gathering at home. Rodrigo's parents, his older brother and his wife, and two couples of friends I didn't know. I had been cooking since 10 in the morning. Pork tenderloin in plum sauce, rice with vegetables, noodle soup, and a tres leches dessert that took me 2 hours to prepare. The table was set with the embroidered tablecloth that Ernesto and I had bought at a crafts market the year we got married. That tablecloth had been there for 40 years, and it still looked good. When the guests arrived, I was serving the dishes in the kitchen. I heard Rodrigo making introductions in the living room. I heard the names, the greetings, the familiar noise of a meeting starting. And then, in a voice that had calculated the volume exactly so that it would reach where I was standing, I heard this. Yes, she lives with us. She's Valeria's mother. She helps us around the house. You know, the old lady that you have to carry around. Laughter. Two or three people laughing. I stood still with the spoon in my hand over the pot. The smell of plum sauce surrounded me. The 48-year-old tablecloth was on the table that I had set. I didn't go out. My expression didn't change. I finished serving the dishes with the same precision with which I filled out files at 3 in the morning. When I entered the dining room with the first tray, Rodrigo looked at me for a second. He was waiting for something, a reaction, a crack. I smiled. I offered him the plate with a nod. Enjoy your meal, I said, and went back to the kitchen. That is the most difficult technique there is, letting the other person wait for a reaction that never comes. Because when the reaction doesn't come, the other person is left exposed, left naked in front of what they have just done, and for a certain type of person that is unbearable. That night, when the guests had left and the house fell silent, I locked myself in my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. The tablecloth was already folded in the drawer again. The pots washed, the dishes in their place. Everything put away by me, as always. And then, when no one could see me, when the door was closed and the only witness was Ernesto's voto, on the nightstand, I allowed myself to feel what I hadn't let out all night. It wasn't crying. It was something deeper than crying, and quieter. It was the feeling that the floor had moved 1 centimeter without anyone else noticing. I opened the notebook, wrote the date, wrote the exact words, and underneath, in slower handwriting, I wrote, "It's no longer carelessness. It's a decision." I turned the page and kept writing. 3 days later, Valeria came into the kitchen while I was making breakfast. She stood behind me silently for a moment and then said in a low voice, "Mom, what Rodrigo said on Friday wasn't right. I already talked to him." I stared at the eggs in the pan and, "Don't worry," I said. "It's just that he sometimes doesn't think before speaking." "It's okay, Valeria." "Are you sure?" "Yes." She hugged me from behind. I let her. She smelled the same perfume of white flowers as always. And I thought, as I added salt to the eggs, how many times can a daughter apologize to the same man before the apologies become part of the problem? I didn't say it out loud. I never said it out loud, but I wrote it in the notebook that night. What came 2 weeks later was the second false resolution, and this one was more elaborate and more expensive, and for that very reason, more revealing. Rodrigo arrived one Saturday at noon with a bag from a department store. He took out a box and placed it on the dining room table without much ceremony. "I brought something, dear, so you won't be bored." It was an electronic tablet, not the cheapest one. I saw it and had 2 thoughts simultaneously. First, that it cost around 4,000 pesos. Second, that same month, Valeria had asked me not to pay for the supermarket because we were really tight. 4,000 pesos for a tablet that I hadn't ordered and no money for the supermarket. I got up, carefully took the box and said, "How kind of you, Rodrigo. Thank you very much." I smiled. I put the box in my room. That afternoon, I took the tablet out of the box, turned it on, and used it to install an additional notes application where I began to transfer the most important records from the notebook in digital format with dates, amounts, and descriptions. Milix to cola. If Rodrigo thought that this gift was a gesture of peace, he was right about one thing he didn't imagine. It helped me better organize what I was building. There were still 9 years ago until that night of Tuesday, September 14th. And Rodrigo still didn't know that every move he made was being documented by the woman he had called the old lady you have to carry around to Hija. But the escalation wasn't over. The moment that marked year 5 was on Mother's Day. Sophia and Damien had made some little cards at school with cut-out letters that they glued together with glue. Damian said, "For my mom and grandma, I love you very much." He gave it to me with both hands, solemnly as only children are solemn when they give something they made themselves. That afternoon, Valeria told me that they had reserved a table at a restaurant to celebrate. I was happy. I got ready. I put on the off-white linen blouse that had belonged to my mother, the only one I keep for special occasions. Ready at 6:30 in the evening, as I had been told. At 7:15, Rodrigo came downstairs with his jacket on and keys in hand. He looked at me from the hallway. "Oh, mother-in-law, you stay. The table is for 4 and the children are already here." "No way." He said it like that, with that naturalness of his that was worse than any shout-em. Valeria was behind him with the children, ready to leave. She looked at me. I looked at her. There was a second of silence between the two of us that weighed as if it had lasted 20 years. I didn't say anything. "There's food on the stove," Valeria said to me in a low voice without quite looking me in the eye. And they left. I stood in the hallway wearing my mother's linen blouse alone on Mother's Day. In the house where I had cooked, cleaned, and paid for the past 5 years. I went into the kitchen, heated up what was on the stove, sat down at the table and ate slowly, unhurriedly, with my back straight just as my mother taught me. Outside the street had that noise of a festive Sunday. Laughter from other windows, the engines of cars from families returning, from celebrating. My mother taught me that dignity does not depend on someone acknowledging it. Dignity is what remains when everything else is taken away. That night, with the dishes already washed and the house silent, I opened the black notebook. I wrote the date. I wrote down what had happened in every detail. And in the right-hand margin, in tight handwriting, I wrote something I had not written on any previous page. It is enough to figure out options. It was not yet a decision. It was something prior to a decision. It was the seed of one, and seeds, when planted by a nurse, grow methodically. The seed took 3 more years to grow, not because I was slow, but because life inside that house had a very esta. Each day was so similar to the last that it was easy to mistake repetition for stability. I got up, cooked, cleaned, made, and kept quiet. The children grew, the notebook filled up, and I kept telling myself that at some point things would catch on their own, that Rodrigo would mature, that Valeria would find her voice. That's what mothers do when we love too much. We replace the obvious with hope. But then came a Wednesday in August at 10:23 in the morning that shattered that hope in a way that was beyond repair. That Wednesday, Valeria and Rodrigo were at work, the children at school. I had finished making the beds and was about to go downstairs to prepare lunch when I heard the house phone ring in the living room. I answered it as always. It was Rodrigo's brother, Gustavo. A voice I knew from family gatherings, always affable, always ready with a joke. When he heard my voice, he fell silent for a second. "Oh, Mrs. Patricia, I thought no one was there. I was looking for Rodrigo." "He's at work," I said. "Should I leave him a message?" No, I'll call him on his cell phone." "Thank you, Mom." And he hung up. 5 minutes later, as I was going downstairs, I heard Rodrigo's cell phone ringing in the kitchen. He had left it on the counter that morning. The screen lit up with Gustavo's name, and then it went off. And then, without me looking for it, without me having any intention of spying, a text message arrived and was visible on the screen before it went dark. The old lady answered the landline. "Be careful what you leave in plain sight." "Have you signed anything for the house?" I remained standing in the kitchen. The phone was already off. The smell of cold coffee filled the space. Outside, a dog barked in the street with the insistence of dogs that bark at something that no one else sees. The house in Guadalajara. My house. The little house that Ernesto and I bought with 20 years of savings. The one I paid for alone for the last 15 years. The one that had been registered in my name since 1987. Has he signed anything about the house yet? I sat down on one of the kitchen chairs. My legs didn't fail me, but I gave them a chance to do so. I breathed with the same technique I taught the families of patients in the emergency room when the news was difficulty. Slow in, slow out, hold for 2 seconds. And then I understood. Rhythm went through me like cold water, that everything had been calculated since before I arrived. Valeria's call, 3 years after Ernesto died. "Come for a while, Mom. Just until the situation stabilizes." The sunny room that Rodrigo showed me at the door. Rodrigo smiled that first day. The entire scaffolding of hospitality they had built had a foundation that I hadn't seen because I didn't want to see it. I wasn't the grandmother who came to help. I was the asset they came to manage. I went up to my room, took out the black notebook, opened it to the last written page, and with a handwriting that didn't shake because I refused to let it shake, I wrote the date, the time, the exact words of the message. Beneath these words, I wrote 3 more: confirm, document, and act, all circled. That same afternoon, at 4:15, I called a lifelong colleague from my cell phone, Lucia Mendrano Mano, a retired nurse like me, but who had studied law in her second life. I told her that I needed a private consultation. She told me to come on Friday. I went on Friday with the notebook, with the receipts that I kept in the wooden box, and with 142 pages of records accumulated over 13 years. Lucia listened to me for 2 whole hours without interrupting me. At the end, she looked at me over her gold-rimmed glasses and said something that I still hear with the same clarity as that Friday. "Patricia, you don't have a family problem, you have a case samba." As I tell you all this, I wonder where in the world you're listening to me from. Write the name of your city in the comments. It doesn't matter if it's a small town or a big city. I want to know how far these words are reaching, because there's something I've learned in 34 years of emergency medicine. Those who best understand the pain of others are those who have already endured their own. Let's continue. Lucia explained 2 things to me that Friday that changed the direction of everything that would come after. The first was that the receipts I had kept for 8 years had enough legal weight to demonstrate a sustained financial contribution to the household without a contract or compensation, that this had a legal name, that this name implied rights that I didn't know I had. The second was that my house in Guadalajara, as long as it was in my name and I didn't sign any transfer documents, was completely mine, that no one could touch it without my express consent, that if someone had been pressuring me to sign something, that also had a legal name. I left Lucia's office at 7:30 at night. The August air was warm and smelled of recent rain, wet grass, and that perfume of damp earth that in Guadalajara they call the smell of petricor, and that since I was a child has given me an inexplicable me that something is going to start. Start. Something was going to start. The following months were the hardest in terms of control because I knew what I knew, and I had to continue living in that house as if I didn't know it. I had to continue serving breakfasts, picking up the children, paying the gas, responding with a new smile when Rodrigo ignored me at the table. I had to contain all that inside a body that no longer wanted to contain it. Then 34 years of emergencies prepare you for exactly that, to function with precision, when everything you feel wants to function the other way around. During those months, Rodrigo made 2 attempts to get me to sign documents. The first was in October, when he presented me with a paper that he described as a home insurance document that needed my signature as a resident. I read it through twice while he waited with a pen outstretched. It was an authorization of notary representation for transactions related to real estate on behalf of residents of the address. I returned the paper to him without signing it. I didn't quite understand the terms, I said with a calm smile. I'll review it calmly and let you know. I never reviewed it with him. I photographed it and sent it to Lucia that same night. The second attempt was in December, wrapped in gift paper and presented as an administrative favor during Christmas dinner in front of the children so that the festive context would lower my defenses. I didn't sign either. By then, Lucia and I already had a plan, and the plan had a date. There were only 5 months left until Tuesday, September 14th, and in those 5 months, I would do something that Rodrigo, with all his calculations, with all his years of planning, never considered possible, never considered. Because there is something that a certain type of man never learns to calculate. Well, the patience of a woman who has already decided. You want to know what I did in those 5 months. What you will find in that answer completely changes the way you will understand everything I have told you so far. Because it turns out that I was not just documenting, I was building. I lived those 5 months on 2 levels at the same time. On the first level, the Patricia that Rodrigo and Valeria saw every day the same. As always, getting up at 5:45, making breakfast, picking up the children, cleaning, paying, keeping quiet, predictable, controlled, without surprises. Oui, exactly what they needed her to be, oui. On the second level, a woman who had woken up. On the first Monday in April, at 9 o'clock in the morning, while Rodrigo and Valeria were at work and the children were at school, I took the bus to the city center. I got off at Federalismo Street and entered the notary public's office number 14. Lucia had made an appointment for me for that specific day. I had the deed to my house in Guadalajara, my identification, and a decision that had taken me too long to make, but once made, it felt like lifting a stone from my chest that I no longer remember when I started carrying. That day, I set up a trust in my house in Guadalajara, the little house that Ernesto and I bought, with 20 years of savings, the one I paid for alone for the last 15. The one that Rodrigo had spent years trying to achieve with papers Días disguised as procedures, was registered in an irrevocable trust in the name of Sofia and Damian. My grandchildren. No, Valeria, not Rodrigo. My grandchildren, who would receive the property when each of them turned 25, managed until then by Lucia as trustee. Rodrigo could do all the paperwork he wanted, convince. Valeria of whatever he wanted, present me with all the papers he wanted. There was nothing left to sign. I left the notary's office at 11:50 in the morning. The April sun in Guadalajara has a particular quality, more white than gold, clear than warm. I stood on the sidewalk watching it for a moment. I breathed in the air of the street, the smell of carnitas from a stand on the corner, the smoke from a passing truck, the perfume of the flowers a woman was selling in front of the building. I bought a bouquet of red carnations and placed them on Ernesto's grave that afternoon. I said quietly, "That's it." But that was just the first move. There were still 4 more to go. The second move was the bank account. I opened my own separate account with everything related to that house at a different bank than the one I usually used. There I began depositing a fixed amount of my retirement pension every 15 days, without telling anyone, without mentioning it, without leaving a trace in the apartment. The third move was the apartment. Through Lucia, I contacted a lady she trusted who was renting a small apartment in the Colonia Americana. 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, interior patio with a purple bougainvillea peeking over the fence. I visited her on a Tuesday at noon, while Rodrigo and Valeria were working. I signed the contract the same day. I paid 3 months in advance. I didn't tell anyone. The fourth move was the longest. It took me 6 weeks to finish it. I took all my records, the 142 pages of the black-covered notebook, the receipts, the transfers, the receipts for gas, internet, groceries, the children's medications, school supplies, Sophia's furs, communion, birthday, presents for her 13th birthday, and I organized them into a 48-page document with the same precision with which the emergency room organized the files of critical patients. Date by date, amount by amount, item by item with a total. At the end, that Lucia reviewed twice, and that both times she looked at me the same after reading it. 447,000 pesos. That was what I had contributed to that house in 13 years. Without a contract, without compensation, without anyone ever acknowledging it. The fifth movement was the envelope. I prepared it on Friday, September 10, 4 days before that night. Inside I put 5 things. A copy of the trust for the Guadalajara house, a copy of the 48-page document with the details of my contributions, Louis Irasta. A letter addressed to Valeria written by hand in the neat, dyed handwriting that my mother taught me when I was a child, Luca Ivon. A copy of the van on a rental contract for the apartment in Colonia Americana. And finally, the little card that Dami had given me on Mother's Day 50 years ago, the one that said to go to my mom and Grant, I love you very much, which I kept, because there are things that a person keeps without knowing why. I sealed the envelope, put it in the little wooden box, and continued living in that house for 4 more days, preparing breakfast, picking up the kids, cleaning, paying, keeping quiet, exactly the same as always, abutay. What I didn't know then was that those last 4 days were going to give me the final push that I needed, because in those last 4 days, Rodrigo reached the limit that none of his previous movements had reached. On Saturday, September 11, at 6:30 in the afternoon, 42 people arrived at the house. It was Rodrigo's 45th birthday. I found out that same Saturday at 12 noon when Valeria mentioned it to me in passing while she was picking up her bag to go to the supermarket, to go to market. And she told me that guests were coming and that I could prepare some appetizer for 42 people. What happened that Saturday, I didn't see on a screen or tell anyone about. I experienced it from the kitchen, standing for 4 hours straight, preparing tostadas, salsas, guacamole, quesadillas, about a vol that took me 3 hours my feet on. The cold tile, the smoke from the griddle, the smell of roasted chili that lingered on my clothes all dull night. And while I cooked, Rodrigo received his guests in the living room. At 9:15 at night, someone uncorked a bottle of champagne that had cost, as I could see from the label when I brought it out of the bag, 2,800 pesos. 2,800 pesos in champagne. The same month that Valeria had told me that she didn't have enough to pay for my blood pressure medication, which I had paid for out of my pension without saying anything, as I always did. Rodrigo raised his glass to his friends and said with that her voice filled any space, for the 45th and for everything that is to come, that this year will be the year that we finally put everything in order. Laughter. Applause. I was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with a nitri of quesadillas in my hands. No one introduced me. No one offered me a drink. No one said, "This is the woman who cooked everything you're eating. I left the tray on the terrace table and returned to the kitchen. I washed my hands, took off my apron, turned off the griddle, and went up to my room with the same calm with which one ends a 12-hour shift in the emergency room. I turned my back on the party of 42 people and closed my bedroom door. It wasn't sadness that I felt that night. It was something colder than sadness and cleaner than anger. It was the total and absolute confirmation of something I already knew, but that until that moment I still carried as a doubt. I didn't doubt it anymore. I opened the wooden box, took out the envelope, and held it in my hands for a moment. Downstairs, the music continued. The voices continued. Rodrigo's laughter came up the stairs as if house were completely his because he believed. It was on Monday, September 13, at 11:47 at night, when the house was silent and the light under Valeri's bedroom door and Rodrigo had been out for over an hour or that hour. I walked downstairs barefoot. The coldness of the mosaic tiles on the ground floor, the smell of the floor wax that I had sealed myself that morning, the darkness of the living room with only the small light from the microwave illuminating the outline of the furniture. I scanned every corner with my eyes. The kitchen that I had cleaned every morning for 13 years. The living room that had long since ceased to feel like mine. The dining room table, empty and silent. Tomorrow, before I left, I would leave on it what needed to be left. I went back up the stairs, entered my room, and sat on the edge of the bed. The envelope rested on top of the small wooden box. There it was. The box was empty for the first time since I had arrived in that house 13 years ago. And I felt, in a way that I still can't quite yet put into words, empty too, but in a good way. The way you feel empty when you let go of something very heavy that you've been carrying for too long. Tomorrow would be the day. I took out the 2 suitcases from the closet. I put them on the bed, turned over Ernesto's photo on the nightstand, and said to him in a low voice, I'm on my way there. Not where you are, where I should be. And I started folding the first shirt. Tuesday, September 14th, dawned completely normal. That was what surprised me the most about that day when I remember it. That it dawned exactly the same as the previous 12,900 days that I woke up in that house. I got up at 5:45, the cold of the tile under my feet, the silence of a house that was still sleeping. I went down to the kitchen, turned on the stove, put the water on to boil. I prepared the usual breakfast, Mexican-style eggs, tortillas, freshly warmed on the griddle, menton. I put Sophia and Damian's lunchboxes on the bar. I set the table for 4. I poured myself a coffee and drank it standing up, looking out the window of the sink. I looked at her one last time, aware that it was the last time. When Valeria came down at 7:10, she found me finishing washing the dishes. She said, "Good morning," without looking up from his phone, Rodrigo. Rodrigo walked to the kitchen, sipping his coffee without saying anything, and I heard the front door close behind him at 7:48. The kids left for school at 7:55. The house fell silent again, with the smell of roasted coffee and warm tortillas hanging in the morning air as if nothing was about to change. I went up to my room. My 2 suitcases were inside the closet, closed since the night before. The wooden box was in the first suitcase, wrapped in my mother's linen blouse so it wouldn't get bumpy. Everything that mattered from my 13 years in that house fit into new suitcases and the wooden box, so the rest were objects that had never been mine. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. I had nothing else to do in that house. Everything was cooked, cleaned, in order. Everything was in order thanks to me, as always. So I waited with the patience of someone who already knows exactly what's going to happen and only needs the clock to confirm it. At 9:17 at night, Valeria entered the kitchen. You know what she said. I told you at the beginning, when I started this story. And you know what I didn't answer, what I didn't do. The way I looked at her. without moving a muscle on my face, and dried my hands with a cloth embroidered with blue flowers. What I still haven't told you is what happened after that silence. I went up the stairs for the last time. I went into the room, took the 2 suitcases from the closet, and put them by the door. I looked at the room for a moment. The bed was made with the same precision as always, the nightstand empty, the closet open and clean with nothing in it, and 13 years reduced to an empty room that tomorrow Valeria would tidy up as if I had never existed inside it. I went down the stairs with the 2 suitcases. The wheels made a small and constant sound on the mosaic, like a clock that finally shows the time that I had been waiting for years. Valeria was in the living room. She saw me with the suitcases and stopped, quiet. Her expression at that moment was that of someone who hears a sound she wasn't expecting and still doesn't understand where it's coming from. "What are you doing?" she said. I didn't answer. I put my bags by the front door. I went into the room for the last time, picked up the envelope I had prepared on top of the wooden box and placed it in her hands without saying a single word. Then I grabbed my bags, opened the front door, and went out. I didn't look back. The September night was warm. It smelled of recent rain and wet earth and that perfume that since I was a child has given me the feeling that something new is beginning. The taxi I had booked that afternoon arrived in 4 minutes. The driver helped me with my bags without asking anything, with the discretion of people who recognize when someone needs silence. I sat in the back seat and looked out the window as the street where I had lived for 13 years receded. It got smaller and disappeared into the darkness as it had always been temporary. I arrived at the apartment in the Colonia Americana at 10:41 a.m. night. The keys were under the mat in an envelope as I had arranged with Lucia. I opened the door. The apartment smelled of new paint and the dried plaster in a small clay cup that someone had left on the bar. The bougainvillea in the interior courtyard peeked through the living room window, just its dark silhouette against the September sky. I put the suitcases in the room. I sat on the floor because there was still no furniture. Only the cot I had brought was visible with a folded blanket on top. And then, yes, alone, in silence, without anyone being able to see me. I allowed myself to cry, not out of sadness. Let that be clear. I cried in the way that only the body can do when it lets go of something that it carried for too long, like when a 24-hour shift ends and you get home and your body finally allows itself to feel the tiredness that it had held in the whole time. That's how I cried, with relief mixed with pain, mixed with something that I took a while to recognize as freedom. I slept for 5 hours straight. The first 5 hours of continuous sleep I got remembered in years. At 8:22 in the morning on Wednesday the 15th, Valeria's first message arrived. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk." I didn't respond. At 9:48, another one. "Mom, I read the envelope. I need you to explain it to me." I didn't respond. At 11:33, another one. And this one wasn't from Valeria, my mother-in-law. Everything she put in that envelope has no legal effect. It's just papers. If you want, we can sit down and talk and reach a reasonable agreement. Rodrigo. I picked up the phone, read the message twice, left it face down on the cot, and went to make myself a coffee because at 11:33. On Wednesday, September 15, Rodrigo still believed he was negotiating. He still believed that I was the same woman who for 13 years had given in unconditionally every time someone put a piece of paper in front of her or lowered their voice. He still didn't know what would happen in 48 hours. Thursday, 16th, passed in a silence that, on the other hand, I knew. It wasn't silence at all. Valeria sent 4 more messages. Rodrigo sent 2. The last one said, "Mother-in-law, let's talk." This still has a solution. No one answered. On Friday, September 17, at 6:52 in the afternoon, exactly 72 hours after I left that house, Lucia called me. "Here," she simply said. I stood there with the phone in my hand for a moment. Outside, the bougainvillea in the courtyard was moving in the afternoon wind. The smell of damp earth again. That smell that always comes when something important is changing. How did they react? I asked her. Lucia paused briefly. Rodrigo called the office half an hour ago, she told me. First he denied that the document was valid. Then he raised his voice. Then he asked if there was any way to reverse it. And I told him to consult his own lawyer. I hung up. I sat down in the green-painted wooden chair that I had bought that morning at the second-hand market for 80 pesos. A chair with a slightly crooked back that seemed to me the most comfortable one I had sat in a long time. Sofia and Damian owned a house and Rodrigo had. Just to understand that everything he had built over the years on the patience of a woman he had thought was harmless had collapsed in 3 days without him being able to do anything to stop it, to stop it. But what he still didn't know, what Valeria hadn't finished processing, was what was contained in the handwritten letter that was at the bottom of the envelope, the one in my tight, clear handwriting that I had learned from my mother. That letter was the one that would change everything in a way that neither of them expected. Because in that letter, I didn't talk about trusts or amounts or legal documents. In that letter, I was talking to my daughter. On Saturday, September 18th at 10:09 in the morning, there was a knock at the apartment door. It wasn't a knock of hesitation or courtesy. It was the knock of someone who has spent days practicing whether or not to knock and has finally decided that he can't go on without doing so. I knew it was Valeria before opening. I took a moment, poured myself the last sip of the coffee I was finishing. I wiped my hands on the dishcloth. I walked toward the door barefoot on the new tile floor that still smelled like it had just been polished. And I opened it. Valeria's eyes were puffy from several days of crying in a bad sleep. She was wearing the same navy blue jacket that I had given her 2 Christmases ago, her hair pulled back, carelessly without the usual arrangement, that she always took care of. In her right hand, she held the envelope that I had left on the dining room table 4 days before, wrinkled at the corners, as if I had opened and closed it many times. I didn't say anything. She too said nothing for a moment, just looked at me. And in that look, there was something that I knew well because I had seen it many times in the hospital hallways. The expression of someone who has just understood something that she can't understand. "May I come in?" she finally said, in a voice that was half the same as the one I remembered. I stepped aside. She entered the small apartment, her eyes scanning it for a second, the bougainvillea peeking through the window, the green wood engeroar gadete, the 2 suitcases that had not yet been unpacked, leaned against the wall of the room. She sat down in the green chair without me offering it to her. She put it on her knee with both hands on it as if it were something fragile. I sat down across from her on the cot. The silence between us lasted as long as a silence that has been going on for 43 years. "I read everything," she finally said. "I know. The trust..." Pause. 447,000 pesos. Another pause. The letter. I didn't say anything. I let her find her words on her own, with as much time as she needed, because you also learn that in emergencies. There are times when the best medicine is silence. "The letter is the one I can't stop reading," she said, and her hands tightened on the envelope a little more. "I want you to know what that letter said because the letter is the center of everything. That's something that no trust agreement nor any 48-page document could manage to state. I wrote it in 2 hours, on a Thursday in August, sitting in the kitchen of that house at 6 in the morning while everyone else was asleep. I wrote it by hand with the blue pen that belonged to my mother, the same one she used to sign my school papers when I was 6 years old. I wrote it without drafts, in one sitting, because when you finally decide to tell the truth, you don't need to rehearse it. I told Valeria that I didn't blame her the same way I blamed Rodrigo, that I understood the difference between a woman who chooses silence and a woman who was taught that silence is what is expected of her, that I myself had made that mistake for too many years, some suvad. I told her that for 38 years I hadn't charged her anything, not because I couldn't, but because I believed that love doesn't need invoices, that I still believed that today, and that's why despite having 447,000 pesos documented with dates and receipts, I hadn't filed any legal claim, that the document existed, that Lucia had it, but that I had chosen not to use it. I told her that the trust wasn't a punishment, it was what it always should have been. Ernesto and Mia's inheritance going directly to those who deserved it, without it going through hands that had been looking for it for the wrong reasons. And in the end, with the same neat and clear handwriting that my mother taught me as a child, I told her just one more thing. I told her that I loved her, but I had loved her since before she was born. Since I felt her move for the first time one February morning that smelled like rain, and that I would continue to love her even if it hurt her or me. But a mother's love cannot be erased with a bad decision or with 10 years of complicit silence. But that love is not a sufficient reason to lose one's dignity. And that dignity, once one learns to take care of it, cannot be returned. Valeria cried when I finished telling her what the letter said. She cried in the way that people cry when what they feel is too much for their bodies and has to come out however they can. I let her cry without interrupting her, without telling her to calm down, without offering her words that still had no place. Outside, the bougainvillea moved in the morning wind. The apartment smelled of coffee and flowers and new paint. The September sun streamed in horizontally through the window on the patio and drew a rectangle of light on the mosaic floor that moved slowly as we sat there, When Valeria was able to speak, she said something I didn't expect. Mom, Rodrigo spoke with his lawyer on Friday. I looked at her. He says that the trust is irrevocable, that there's nothing you can do. He paused and said that if you wanted to, with the receipts you have, you could sue him. I know, I said. Why didn't you do it? Before I answer that, I need to ask you something because there's a decision I made at that moment sitting in front of my daughter in that small apartment with the bougainvillea peeking through the window that I still wonder if it was right. And I want to know what you think. What would you have done in my place? Would you have sued? Would you have demanded those 447,000 pesos? Or would you have done what I did? Write it to me in the comments. I really want to know. Because there's no one right answer to this. And part of what I learned throughout this process is that difficult decisions look different depending on where you're looking at them from. Now, I'll answer you. I didn't sue him because I already have what I needed. I told Valeria. I have my house, I have my apartment, I have my savings, I have my clean name, and my bank book full. I put my hand on hers, and I have Sophia and Damian with a future that no one can take away from them. That's enough. Valeria looked at me for a long moment. It's not enough for what he did to you, she said, in a very low voice. I didn't recognize it, but it's enough for me. It's important to make that distinction clear. There are things that can't be paid for with money or sentences. There are damages that one decides not to pursue, not out of weakness, but because pursuing them would cost more than what she would receive in return. And an emergency nurse learns sooner or later that not all patients can be saved, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth trying. What did happen with Rodrigo didn't depend on me. It depended on Rodrigo's family. Gustavo, his brother, the one who had sent the message on the cell phone that I saw that Wednesday in August, called Lucia. On Monday, September 20, not to threaten, but to ask. Lucia told me that afternoon that Gustavo had asked very specific questions about the documents, about the attempts at notarized transfers, about the paperwork disguised as insurance paperwork, Daddy's insurance paperwork. 3 days later, Rodrigo's mother called Valeria. I don't know exactly what she said. I only know what Valeria told me weeks later, that the woman cried during that call, that she told her that she hadn't raised her son for that if what the documents said was true, Rodrigo would have to answer to God and his own family before any court, before any court. At the distributorship where Rodrigo worked, his direct boss was Gustavo's brother-in-law. In November, Rodrigo was no longer a sales supervisor. I'm not going to say I was happy about that. It would be a lie if I said that I didn't feel anything, but what I felt wasn't joy. It was something more like the feeling a nurse has when a difficult prognosis turns out exactly as she anticipated. There's no satisfaction, just the cold confirmation that events have consequences if one doesn't personally manage them. Rodrigo reaped what he sowed, without me moving a single paper to make that happen. What no one had told me, what I found out in December from a cousin of Valeria's who called me without telling anyone, was the most revealing part of the whole story. 2 weeks after I left, Rodrigo posted a photo on his social media from a weekend at a hotel on the outskirts of the city. To champagne, a pool, the same bottle for 2,800 pesos or an equal one. The text said, renewing energy. But sometimes you have to let go of what doesn't add up anymore. 13 years of food, cleaning, care, and 447,000 pesos. That was what I didn't remember. I saved it on my phone, not to show it to anyone, just so that the day my memory wanted to soften what happened, there would be a record to prevent it. Because records don't have bad days. Records don't forget. I learned that in the emergency room and applied it for 13 years in a kitchen that was never completely mine. Valeria came to the apartment 3 more times in October. The 4th time she brought Sofia and Damian. Damian ran in, hugged me tight on the waist, no words, that child's strength, totally out of control. Sofia stood in the doorway for a moment, serious as she has always been since she was little, with that adult expression she has had since she was 6 years old. Then she walked over to me, put her arms around my neck and whispered something in my ear that I won't repeat here because it is mine, and mine alone. But I tell you this, it was enough. It was more than enough. Valeria and Rodrigo are still married to this day. That was their decision, and I have neither the right nor the desire to judge her. What did change? What Valeria told me one November afternoon as we sat on the patio with the bougainvillea in bloom above our heads was this. Mom, I told Rodrigo that if he ever treats anyone in my family the way he treated you again, I'm leaving without negotiation, without a second chance. I looked at her, and he said, yes. And did you believe him? Valeria took a moment. I still don't know, she said honestly. But this time, if he doesn't comply, I already know what I have to do, because I saw what you did, and I already know it can be done. That was the most important thing I took away from that whole conversation. Not the apology, not the explanation, but that I already know it can be done. Because sometimes mothers don't teach with words, we teach with what we do when no one expects us to do it. I turned Ernesto's photo over on the nightstand in the new apartment. I said, see, it's possible. Today, 14 months have passed since that night on Tuesday, September 14. The apartment in Colonia Americana no longer smells like new paint. It smells like what you want your home to smell like when you can choose it for the first time in a long time. It smells like pot coffee and the flowers of the bougainvillea, which in October were filled with purple until they almost covered the entire window to the patio. It smells like the books that I finally took out of the box and put on the bookcase that I bought at the second-hand market for 120 pesos, the same one where I found the green chair. I woke up this morning at 7:30, not at 5:45, not 9. At 7:30, when the sun was already high, and the street already had the noise of the bakery and the dog and the neighbor sweeping the sidewalk. I drank my coffee sitting in the green chair, looking at the bougainvillea, without hurry, without lunchboxes to prepare, without other people's dishes to wash, without anyone waiting, nothing about me that I hadn't decided to give first. That silence of free mornings, it took me weeks to learn to inhabit it without feeling guilty. Because women of my generation learned that rest must be earned, that being still is synonymous with being lazy, that a mother who is not serving someone at all times is a mother who is failing in some way. Lie. All that. Lie. Rest is not earned. Rest is deserved. And it is deserved by anyone who has given honestly, regardless of whether someone recognized it or not. That took me 61 years to learn. And I learned it in a small apartment with a bougainvillea and a crooked chair and 2 suitcases that weren't finished unpacking. Sophia and Damian come every 15 days. On Saturday afternoons, sometimes with Valeria, sometimes alone when Valeria drops them off in the taxi, and they run up the stairs and knock with both fists, as if they were in a hurry to get there, even though they are already here. I prepare whatever they ask for. Sophia asks for soup noodles. Damian orders squash blossom quesadillas because he tried them once and decided they were his favorite food in the world. I sit with them at the table and we eat leisurely. And we talk about kid stuff that I listen to more attentively than they realize. 3 weeks ago, Damian asked me, with his mouth still full of quesadillas, if I was happy in that department. I told him yes. He looked at me with that seriousness of a child who thinks before he speaks and said, "Good, because it does smell like you here, Grandma." I didn't know what to say to him. I just put more quesadillas on his plate, but what he told me stayed with me for several days, that the house where I lived for 13 years didn't smell like me, and that he, at 10 years old, and with his mouth full, had noticed it before I did. Children see what adults learn to ignore. Now I want to tell you something I didn't tell you before, something that was in that envelope I left on the dining room table inside. The handwritten letter. Something I didn't mention when I told you what the letter said, because I needed you to get to this point to understand why I saved it for last. Inside the envelope, along with the letter, I put a photograph. It was a small photo, a little yellowed with age, taken at the General Hospital of Guadalajara sometime in 1990. In the photo, I'm 29 years old, wearing a white nurse's uniform, my hair tied back and on my lap. Asleep with her cheek resting on my chest is Valeria. She must have been 3 years old. That day, Ernesto had to take her to the hospital because I couldn't get off shift. And at some point between one patient and another, Valeria fell asleep on top of me in the break room. Someone took the photo of us. I don't know who. I don't know when it came into my hands, but I kept it for more than 30 years because there are images that you keep without knowing yet what you're going to need them for. On the back of that photograph, with the same blue pen that was my mother's, I wrote 4 words. "You were always my best work." That was what Valeria couldn't stop reading. Not the trust, not the 447,000 pesos. Not the 48 minus page documents. 4 words written on the back of a 30-minus-year-old photo. Because in the end, after everything that happened, after the records and the receipts and the black-covered notebook and the notary public number 14, what mattered most was not what I had documented, it was what I had felt. And I knew how to document that too. If there is something, what I took away from these 13 years, and I say this without bitterness because bitterness is a burden I am no longer willing to carry, is this: that true love does not ask you to disappear to prove that it exists. That a real family is not measured by blood, but by the respect you have for each other in the moments when no one is looking. And that the dignity that my mother taught me in a humble home where the tables were never empty is not something that anyone can take away from you if you do not let them. First, they wanted to take it from me, and I allowed them to for far too long. That is true. I carry that too. But there is a difference between carrying a mistake and living under it forever. You pick it up, examine it, learn what it has to teach you, and keep walking. I keep walking. This morning, before sitting down with my coffee in front of the bougainvillea, I went through the room and said good morning to the photo of Ernesto on the nightstand, like I have every morning since I arrived in this apartment. I told him about Damian. He's already lost her first bottom tooth. That Sophia won a reading contest at school. That the bougainvillea has grown more this year than last year. And I know Ace told her, as I always tell her, from that night when I arrived with 2 suitcases and sat on the floor crying with relief. Thank you for teaching me to document what matters. Because in the it turned out that the most important things weren't in the black-covered notebook, they were in a small yellowed photograph that I kept for 30 years without knowing why I ite pusto. That night of Tuesday, September 14, my daughter told me that I was no longer good for anything, that I only ate and gained weight. 14 months on, I realized she was right about one thing. I cannot stay quiet when I ought to speak. I won't stand for what I don't deserve anymore. I'm no longer good at making myself small in the spaces where I should be able to grow. I'm no longer good at giving without caring about what it costs me. She's right. I'm no longer good at that. And I should never have been good at that in the first place.